I've been asked to share my story this morning of how God brought me to saving faith in Jesus Christ. I do this not because I like to stand up in front of people telling a story about me, but only because I think it brings into sharp focus the power of God to change people's lives. My story begins in Mobile, Alabama, a city that was founded in 1702 and steeped in Southern history and tradition, and had a huge impact on shaping me, obviously, as I grew up there over the years. I led a pretty ordinary life, I would say, at least the early part of it. I did the things most people do. Went to school and made decent grades and kept my nose clean, so to speak, and went to church. I was very frequently in church. My mother ensured that all of us were in church on Sunday, and really was probably pretty average kid up until about my junior year in high school. When I was about 13 years old, I did make a profession of faith at the church I was attending, which unfortunately had very little impact on me. In fact, it might be more accurate to say no impact on me. Although I was sincere at the time, have to say that, but it did not connect. But the one thing it did do for me, though, is that it gave me a great sigh of relief. I no longer worried about what would happen to me when I died. I wasn't worried about going to hell. Thought heaven was my destination. Then having checked that box, I proceeded to live the way I wanted to live. Well, this began to bear some very bad fruit as I entered into my junior year in high school. What was happening at that particular point was the public schools in the South and in Alabama were being desegregated. Now, this would have been 1963. Now, prior to that, from 1702 to 1963 in Mobile and throughout most of the South, well, segregation had been the norm. People didn't have any frame of reference other than that for living their lives and the way society should function. And so when the federal courts ordered that public schools and facilities be desegregated, it created a huge uproar in the South and a great deal of social turbulence. And my high school was at the center of some of this. When I went to school to start the school year in September, I found the campus surrounded by troops who were there to ensure the good order of the campus and the students as some black women or young ladies were enrolled. And I became very angry about that, and others did too, but probably much more so for me. I protested it, and I found others that felt as I did, began to read racist and anti-Semitic literature, and in a rather short period of time became indoctrinated with really strongly racist thought, and began to develop greater and greater hatred for black people and also for Jews, because the material I was reading said that the Jews were ultimately behind all of this. They were behind communism. They were behind the desegregation that was taking place in the South. And so they were the ultimate culprits. So reading all of this stuff just inflamed anger and hatred in my life. And as you can imagine, this sort of thing spilled over into other areas. I moved over to Mississippi in an effort to be more involved in the terrorist activity that was going on there. And to make yet another leap and get right to the heart of the story, one evening, two of us went to Meridian, Mississippi to bomb the home of a Jewish businessman. He had been outspoken about civil rights and very outspoken against the Klan. And so we went to try to make an example out of him and took a bomb, 29 sticks of dynamite, to be delivered to his home. We arrived about 1 o'clock in the morning, I think, to leave this package and then proceed on. And as I pulled up in front of the home to take it to the carport, well, everything looked very quiet and normal. So I was about halfway there from the street to the carport when shooting erupted. I had no idea what was going on, except I just instinctively spun around, dropped the bomb on the concrete driveway, and it was miraculous that it didn't explode at that point. And spun around, ran back to the car, and as I got to the car, I was hit with a load of double-aught buckshot, very close range. Managed to get in the car with the help of a person with me, a young school teacher actually from Jackson, Mississippi, who was an undercover member of the Klan. We sped off in a hail of gunfire, and she was hit and died on the seat there right next to me as I was trying to get out of that area. Almost immediately, a police cruiser was on my bumper. The officer on the passenger side was hanging out the window with a shotgun, blasting away. And this chase went on for maybe 15 blocks in a residential area. And I was eventually, the back windshield was blown out. Tires were hit. I had to come to a skidding halt against a curb, and the police car collided into my car. And I got out and opened fire on the police car. And I had a submachine gun and just sprayed the car. The driver saw what was about to happen, and he ducked. The other officer was about halfway out of the car and was hit 3 times in the chest with 9mm fire, once in the heart. When my clip emptied, the other officer popped up with his shotgun and fired, and I was hit again, close range, double-aught buckshot. He went to take care of his partner, and I staggered away and collapsed behind a house a few hundred feet away. Miraculously, he was able to get his partner's heart beating again, and the guy wound up recovering and getting out of the hospital sooner than I did. It was just absolutely a miracle. So about 5 minutes maybe after this exchange of gunfire, I collapsed behind this house, as I mentioned, and police and FBI agents and state troopers had all converged on the area. This initial ambush was staked out by 26 SWAT team members, so there were a lot of people in the area that knew what was going to happen and were ready for it, and they converged then on this spot and were searching around for me. Where did I go? They saw me sprawled out there on the ground and came up very cautiously with their lights on, got almost over me, turned off the lights and opened fire with their shotguns, and I was hit twice at a range of about 10 feet, I guess. When they turned the lights on, I was still breathing, and one pulled out his pistol to finish me off, and at precisely that moment, an ambulance driver raced up to see if he could be helpful, and so that spared my life. I was loaded on a stretcher and taken to the hospital, and when I got there, the physicians told me that if I lived 45 minutes, it would be a miracle. I was bleeding profusely from numerous spots and barely conscious. So they took me in and worked on me a bit and then took me into surgery with no one expecting I would come out alive. But I did, and I can only attribute that to a miraculous intervention. And in fact, others have said the same thing. The medical staff couldn't believe it. It's just extraordinary that someone could live through what I went through. Well, I spent a number of weeks in the hospital with surgeries and being put in good enough condition to be transferred to the jail. Then I spent several months there awaiting trial, was convicted and given a 30-year sentence in the state penitentiary in Mississippi, which held the distinction of being one of the worst penitentiaries in the United States at that point. I went there with really one goal, and that was to escape as soon as possible and resume my activities. That took about 6 months, probably, 6 or 7 months, with the help of some of my colleagues. I was able to, I recruited 2 others there in the prison to go with me and to pull off this escape, which went pretty much according to plan. And we were, before they really understood exactly what had happened, we were well clear of the area. And within, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 hours, we were a couple of 100 miles away at a camp that had been specially set up for us. So it seemed like things were going well, and the future was bright. But the second day that we were there at that camp, I had been standing watch. It was in a densely wooded area, and we watched an old farm road that went nearby. And so, hiding back far off the road, but with a good enough vantage point to see the traffic, we took turns. I had been standing watch for several hours, and my watch was almost up. I had about 30 minutes more. But for some reason, one of the other inmates that was part of the escape came and relieved me early. And so I went back to the camp, and it was only a matter of a few minutes before I heard this incredible outburst of gunfire, of all sorts of gunfire. I had no idea what was going on, but it became clear soon enough that the FBI had sent their SWAT team. They'd found out where we were. They sent their SWAT team. They were quietly moving up through the woods on this position. And they saw this guy first, right where I had been 5 minutes earlier. And they were armed with machine guns and grenade launchers and everything you can imagine. And he was killed instantly. They gave an opportunity for surrender, and so I surrendered along with the other guy, and we were taken back to the penitentiary. I was placed in the maximum security unit in a little 6x9 cell where I would spend quite a bit of time. The first year in that cell, I occupied myself with reading. That was about all I could do. You weren't allowed out of the cell except twice a week for a shower, which took about 15 or 20 minutes. Otherwise, you were in the cell 24/7. Meals were delivered to you, passed through the door on a steel tray, and there was nowhere to go and nothing to do. The only way to maintain any sanity was to busy yourself reading. And so I did that, and I wish I could say I read something that was valuable and helpful and worthwhile, but actually I devoted all of my attention to racist and anti-Semitic and neo-fascist materials. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich was one book I can remember. Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler was another one. There are many books like that that I went through. And then after a time, I shifted from that and began to read classical philosophy, which I enjoyed tremendously. And this helped me actually to develop a desire for truth, to realize that there is a truth that exists independently of what our interests or preferences might be, and that the greatest thing we can do is really to seek that truth, to understand truth, to know truth and reality. And so that was a fundamental shift in my way of thinking. After a while, I felt drawn to read the Bible. Now, I didn't feel this because I thought that I needed God in any way, because, as I indicated earlier, I felt like I'd checked the box. And of course, everything that I had been doing was done in the name of God and country. That may sound very bizarre, especially today, so many years later, but in that period, these things were in the South considered to be part of a resistance, you might say, and a warfare to try to fight for America, be patriotic, and also preserve the purity of the white race. And these were things that God was pleased with, and so we were fighting for God and country. So I didn't have any felt need for salvation, but I felt drawn nonetheless to read the Bible. And so I had read it before, not a lot, but certainly enough to have some basic familiarity. And so as I began to read in the New Testament, I felt drawn to read the Gospels, and reading about the life of Jesus had quite a profound impact on me. And finally I came to a verse that said, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" And that just nailed me. It really seized my attention. And I began to think about that. And began to realize that really that's what I had been doing. I had been selling my soul to try to achieve things in the world that I thought were important. So over a period of days, it became clearer and clearer to me the evil of my life, the sins I had committed, my whole me-oriented, self-centered way of living, of which this political activism and terrorist campaign were simply a manifestation. I came finally to a point of realizing that what had happened to me when I was 13 years old, making a profession of faith, really was very deficient and inadequate and hadn't really produced in me the kind of life that I read about in the Bible. I realized that what I needed to do was to get on my knees and pray to Jesus Christ. And that's what I did one night. Just got down on the cold concrete floor and prayed a very simple prayer as I had been dealing with the reality of my sins and my great need for forgiveness. I just prayed and asked Jesus to forgive me of my sins and take over my life and do whatever He wanted to do with it. And at that point, something changed inside of me. I wasn't expecting a change. I was really surprised by all that had happened in the days earlier. I had no idea the Bible was going to have this kind of an impact on me. But, it was like as I was reading over these days, it was like being in a pitch black room where somebody begins slowly to turn up the light and you begin to see things that were maybe all around you, but you hadn't seen before. To see them more clearly, and to see the shapes and to see the textures. And as the light became clearer and clearer within me, I began to understand more and more about myself and my need for God. And so here I was, on my knees praying, and this amazing change came into my life, unsought. Well, the next day I found within me a hunger to read the Bible, to read 6-8 hours a day became normal for me. I just couldn't get enough of the Scripture. And I wanted to pray as well, not just praying to get out of jail, that sort of thing, but my life began to develop in prayer. And maybe most telling of all, there was a deep desire in my heart to live for God. And these things have stayed with me now all these years. That was 1970, so that's over 40 years ago. As I began to do this, began to read the Bible, my mind began to be renewed. I began to see truth and reality and recognize the error that I had been immersed in. And things started falling away, falling off, became obvious. The path to follow and the things to believe and the way to live. So that launched a process of change for me. And I think that is the crucial point. Genuine conversion is followed by a changed life. A changed life that continues to change, because it isn't all done in a day. So I've been now for over 40 years changing, growing daily, the Lord helping me to see and to work through stuff of the past. Some things changed very quickly. Others took more time. Still others are in the process of change. So it's a lifelong journey. The phrase, a long obedience in the same direction, is a helpful description. But it is a long, slow business, really getting to know God and to be transformed. But the good news is that God does this kind of transformation in our lives if we give our lives to Him and ask Him to do it and stick with Him, persevere through good times and bad, through joys and sorrows, no matter what. And so, from those early beginnings, I stumbling and trying to find my way, the Lord would work on this, that, or the other problem. Lots and lots of problems that needed working out. And I stayed in prison for, I guess, about 6 years after conversion. And the Lord was using that time to knock off some rough edges, you might say. And there were plenty that needed knocking off. God, sometimes we think, well, if I turn to God, He will bail me out of my problems. My experience has been that God doesn't necessarily bail you out of your problems. He comes to be with you in the midst of them and to help you through them and use them to help you to get to know Him better and to be transformed, and learn to love other people. And so that was my experience. I went through this period, and some really interesting things happened. I began to develop friendships with black guys there in the prison, which would have never happened before I came to Christ. The FBI agent who set up this ambush in Meridian, Mississippi in the first place was sent by J. Edgar Hoover to investigate my religion. Hoover got word of it, and he said, well, this is just a scam, probably a con job to try to find some way to escape again. And so this agent, Frank Watts, was sent back up to the state penitentiary to interview me and see what happened. And I just told him what had occurred in my life, and he was flabbergasted because he had known me before, and he's now looking at me, and he said that I looked different, significantly different, and it got his attention. So he went back home not really knowing exactly what to think about it all, but it made a major impact in his heart, and he began to think about his own life and began to realize that he had been a church member and a good moral man, but he had never had this life-changing encounter with Jesus Christ. And that happened to him probably a couple of months after our meeting. And then he and I became good friends and were until he died a few years ago. So I could go on and on telling about these interesting people. Another one, at the insistence of Frank Watts, one of the leaders of the Jewish community, came up to the prison to meet me and talk with me. Now, this is a guy who's a really tough, hardline criminal attorney. And he took a year off of his law practice to try to break up Klan activity in Mississippi. And he hated me with a passion. And he resisted the idea of coming to meet me. But finally, he gave in. And so when we got together, it was a bit tense at first, just the two of us in a room. But by the time it was over, I can't explain how this happened, but we had become friends. it can only be attributed to God's grace working in that situation. But later he would play a significant role in helping me get out of prison, which is just boggles the imagination. Well, I spent a total of 8 years in prison, in confinement, and for about 5 or 6 of those years worked for the chaplains. I was released eventually from that little 6x9 cell, went to work with the prison chaplains, and in a remarkable turn of events was approved to do a study program at the University of Mississippi, be released early to go work on a degree there. And so I went up to the university and was part of the classics program, and really enjoyed my time there, my studies. Had a wonderful experience with other believers, and growing more in new and different ways. And from there I moved to the Washington, D.C. area. And that began another chapter of life. It's just amazing as I look back. It began with campus ministry, and then moved into pastoral ministry with a couple of churches. The last one was in Washington, D.C., which had whites, blacks, Hispanics. It was a mixed church. And from there to the C.S. Lewis Institute, where I've been for the last 13, 14 years. Along the way, I got a master's degree in divinity and a doctor of ministry degree, and have had wonderful opportunities to serve God and to try to help people grow in their knowledge and love of Jesus Christ. Also address the whole question of racism and hatred. Did this in part through a book I wrote with Dr. John Perkins, and also in speaking in various contexts about Christian faith and the whole area of racial reconciliation. How is it then that I actually came to faith? Was it simply a matter of picking up the Bible and reading it? Well, there's more to the story, and I didn't know it at the time, but there was a group praying for me. It was actually led by the wife of this FBI agent who had set up the ambush, and she and her friends met weekly, and they were praying for my conversion. And sometimes they would spend hours praying just for me. I don't know why they focused so much attention on me, but they really felt the Lord was leading them to do this. And so they kept praying. And they were women who had a really strong faith. And so they prayed 2 years before I was converted. Just quietly, faithfully, praying and believing that God could do anything. And also they were praying for Frank Watts. And so when you look back, you begin to see what is not necessarily visible, that it's really prayer that brings change, and change in people's lives, change in situations in the world. And very little prayer actually is done compared to the great needs we have in the world today. But when people get together and begin to pray seriously in faith, based on what the Bible says, extraordinary things happen. And there's a long, long history of this when you begin to read Christian church history and Christian biographies. You see this. It's not a secret. It's not a special idea. It's all through the Bible as well. Well, there's much more I could say about what God has done in my life. I don't deserve any of it. Some while ago, I heard this. Grace is receiving what you don't deserve. Justice is receiving what you do deserve. Mercy is not receiving what you do deserve. And I can only say that it's what I deserved was to stay in prison, well, to die in the first instance, but having survived, certainly to stay in prison and serve my full term. That's what I deserved. But God had mercy. He didn't give me what I deserved. Instead, He showed His grace, giving me what I did not deserve by moving these women to pray and by allowing me to have a Bible to read and by working in my heart and convicting me of sin and bringing me to faith in Jesus Christ. It's only by grace that we're saved. That grace is available to anyone, no matter who you are or what you have done. God will forgive you and transform your life if you will put your trust in Jesus Christ as your Savior and Lord. He's done it for me. He's done it for countless other people through the centuries, and He will do it for you.